not someone who takes a lot of risks. I remember taking a family trip to Disneyland in California, and there was this ride called Space Mountain. And the line was about a mile long, and along the path there were signs up that said, if you're pregnant, if you have a back problem, if you have a heart condition, and it went on, we don't think you should take this ride. And I thought, why in the world would you voluntarily go on a ride with all those warnings? So you won't ever see me go on a roller coaster. And many of you know I don't like to fly. And when I do, I seem to be the only one listening to the instructions from the stewardess. Because I still want to know that my oxygen mask is going to come down, and I want to know where the closest exit is. It's just the way I am. It's the way I grew up. I follow rules, and I try very hard not to break them, and I don't like taking unnecessary risks. Which brings me to today. This week, working on this message, I felt the deep sense that God was calling upon me to take a risk. So I want to share with you a story. There was a family that lived in the suburbs of New York City. The dad was the president and owner of a construction company. Mom stayed at home raising their 2 daughters. The family fell on hard times. The father had no work, and as a result, they lost their home, and with their 3 dogs in tow, they had to find a place to live. Starting out in motel rooms, moving through the rotation of friends and family, wearing out their welcome, and with no other place to go, they approached the sisters of a local convent. Now, the father couldn't stay there because no man had slept in the convent, so he stayed at a local church shelter for men. And the 3 dogs, well, eventually the family couldn't keep them, so they had to find a new home. For 4 months, the family lived in the shelter and in the convent, and the nuns treated the mother and the daughters like family. They weren't Catholic, but they welcomed them with open arms. There were 4 floors of the convent. 2 of them were rooms, like dormitory-style rooms, and the mother and the 2 daughters, they each were given a little room of their own. The nuns provided shelter, food, friendship. The family came together, and each person got a job, and together they pooled their money, and when they had saved enough, they rented an apartment. And the nuns even helped them move. Several of the nuns got some stuff together. They put mattresses and towels, blankets, all things that the family had to let go of when they were evicted from their home. And the nuns expected nothing in return. Nothing. Years later, they moved on. The kids got older and moved out, and the mom and dad worked until they retired. And when the mother passed away, the girls requested that any donations be made in her memory, that they go to the sisters. And that was more than 20 years after the nuns had opened their home to this family. I share this story with you for a reason. It's true, and it happened to my family. And I could tell you I don't know what I would have done if my mother and my sister and I had been separated. I don't know what I would have done if I had to go through that time alone. The sisters saved my life. They saved my family's life. We were homeless. And in such a crisis, we were forced to focus on just finding a place to live and staying together. And I could say with absolute certainty that what made that crisis a little bit more bearable was that we stayed together. I know this sounds like an awful cliche, but there were 3 things that got us through: faith, hope, and charity. It was faith because we did know, we really believed that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel. Hope because through it all, we were able to stay together. And charity because without the love and without the help and care of the Sisters of the Divine Compassion, we would never have been able to stay together. The response of the nuns was unconditional love of their neighbor. And it didn't come out of a place of something they had to do because of their religion or vocation. It came from a genuine place of grace and faith. This has been a hard week in our country. Many of us have seen the news. We've seen the pictures of children and families at our borders. It's been everywhere, everywhere. And as a priest, it has been a challenge. I tell you honestly, I've never felt so helpless. Not knowing what to do, not knowing how to help, and feeling that when I see these pictures on the news, this overwhelming sense of being powerless. I have felt challenged on so many levels of feelings of heartache. So I looked to the readings for today. I read the gospel reading and I thought, you know what? Jesus gives his disciples something and he gives us something. When that boat sets out and the winds come up and it starts to rain and the waves are going everywhere and all the disciples think they're going to die and they go to Jesus for help, he says to them, "Why are you afraid? Where's your faith?" He doesn't say to them, "Don't be afraid." And there is the message. We can't allow fear to take over. I think upon the words from Jesus who calms the storm, "Peace, be still." In that peace and in that stillness, we were given the revelation that God doesn't always step in and take away the storms, but God gives us what we need to walk through them and what we need to survive. There has been a fierce storm brewing these last couple of weeks, and God isn't going to just wave a hand and make it all go away. God walks with us, and he is walking with each family and each child through that storm. And each of us are given what we need to look into the eye of the storm and find God. That summer in the convent was a storm for my family. And we've all lived through our own storms. Human beings face storms every day. Our faith tells us that Christ is with us to help us through those storms, to calm the wind, to make the water steadier. Yet even in the calmest of storms, we cannot remain complacent. It is in the peacefulness. It's when we have been through a storm and then we come out and we find a sense of peace in our own storm. It's in that peacefulness in our own storm where we have to remember that there are others still going through howling winds. As God helps us, God empowers us to help others. And that seems to be the issue at hand. We have been helped in our storms. And what do we do to help others find faith to walk them through their storms? How do we help families in crisis? How do we help children that are alone? And how do we help with a storm or a crisis that might not affect us personally, but our faith bubbles up and says to us, what do we do? I don't have the answers. I don't know. I don't know what to do. There are no perfect answers. There's no wonderful, great plan that's going to solve all of this. What the psalmist asks us to do and what Jesus asks us to do is to acknowledge God, our higher power, as the guiding force in our lives, and then to look at our responses and ask ourselves, where is God? Are we seeing God? And it's the hardest thing to do. It's right up there with praying for our enemies and those who persecute us. Because we can never be sure of what God really wants us to do. We can't always be 100% sure that we're ultimately doing what God asks. But we're always faithful when we ask the question. Asking questions, prayer, loving our neighbor, all of this is how we bring the gospel to life, how we give it breath, how we give it body. It's more than just a written word. Our call to love our neighbor as ourselves is a beautiful, powerful prayer. We all know it by heart. But it's more than that. It's a call to not just say the prayer, but to live it out, to give it life. And it's one of the most difficult things that Christ asks, and it's one of the most difficult things that God will ask of us. I pray that we think upon the presence of Jesus calming the storm, to take a moment of peace and be still and try to remember the time when we walked through a storm and we were helped. Or perhaps when we fell and somebody reached down a hand to lift us up. For me, I think of the sisters. I think of their presence that helped calm our storm. That is what gives me the strength to acknowledge that I don't have all the answers, but I have faith. And with God's help, I can try to search out and find the face of God in all of those that are suffering and take a risk to reach out in whatever way that God might be calling us. It isn't easy, this life that we live as Christians. It's even harder as human beings. And in those that are suffering our fear, our concern, our struggle to do the right thing, we can face that fear, remembering that God shows no partiality. God walks everybody through their storms. God walks with us. And God is walking with each and every person, every family, every father, every mother, every child that comes and asks for help, that comes to the border and asks for help. God is walking with them. And it's that certainty that can give us the strength to do something possible when any risk seems impossible. So say a prayer before you get on that roller coaster. Life can offer us a very bumpy ride, but we know. And now we are called to remind others, and if they don't know, to tell them that along those bumps, God is riding those bumps with us, and God is in the eye of the storm. Amen.